Hey guys, this is Patrick from STH. Today, we're going to take a look at this thing right here, which is the Intel Xeon D. And you might say, Patrick, we've seen Intel Xeon D many a times on STH, but this is not the Xeon D 1500. It's not the Xeon D 1600. In fact, this is the brand new Xeon D 1700 series. And today, we're going to talk about not only the 1700 series, but also the Xeon D 2700 series, which is another Ice Lake-D generation part that's being launched. And we're going to go talk about everything Ice Lake. We've been working with these things for the last couple weeks, and I'm really excited that we finally get to share it with you. And one of the coolest features before we get too far in this is just, let's talk about networking, because we've had 10 gig as part of Broadwell-DE and the Xeon D 1500 series for years in the space, but this generation brings us something new, and this little Supermicro board right here has 25 gig Ethernet. And so, welcome to a new era of embedded networking. This is really the first piece that we're going to be doing on Intel Ice Lake-D. We're going to definitely have more content on the D1700 and D2700 series coming up. And specifically, we're also going to have a lot of that on the STH main site. So if there are things that you want to see either on video or on the STH main site, let me know in the comments down below as I go through this. Frankly, we definitely do not have an entire set of information. We don't even have the SKU list, and I'm literally recording this the night before because I was hoping that I would get the SKU list by the time that it launched. But unfortunately, we don't have that right now, so that'll be something that, of course, we're going to have on the STH main site. We may not have a SKU list, but what we do have is hardware, and lots of hardware. And so I do want to just call out real quick that we are going to be, saying that we're sponsored by Intel on this, and also, Supermicro. We have like 3 Supermicro systems that we're going to be using for this. So I have a lot of, insights in terms of using these systems that I'm really excited to get to share. But let's talk about what Ice Lake-D is and why it's different and so cool that we're finally getting a refresh. But I would be totally remiss if I didn't just take 1 second to talk about the first time I encountered Xeon D. It was back in 2015, and I got a call from my Intel contact, and he said, "Hey, Patrick, if you want to do a review of this new thing, Broadwell-DE," it's before, Broadwell, the Xeon E5 2600 V4 generation was launching. And I said, "Yeah, I totally want to go do that." And he's like, "Yeah, I got this little system for you." And so he comes over and I get this box, and this thing is just absolutely huge. It's like a 4U tower server-ish thing. And it had Beverly Cove, which was the little card that was in it. And that was kind of the, precursor to the Facebook Yosemite. Xeon D, of course, was very big in the Facebook Yosemite platform for years. And this was the most awesome little system. It didn't really use that much power, but the thing I will never forget about the system, other than the fact that it was awesome, was the fact that it was super loud. It had jet engines for fans, and I have no idea why. The whole thing used less than 100 watts, and it was in this giant case, but it was super loud. Luckily with this launch, we have much more refined systems, but I do remember back to the original Xeon D launch and how much fun that one was just to get to be the first person to actually get to test it. We also, I think, were the first to test the Xeon D 2100 series, which means that basically I love Xeon D. All right, so let's get into the architecture just really quickly, and I'm going to run through a couple of Intel slides on this because I think that they're pretty good in terms of just explaining what's going on, and I'm going to add a little bit of color because there are some things that may not be necessarily obvious if you're just kind of reading through them. And the first thing I think we really need to get to is just the fact that there are 2 different chips that are launching. There's first the Xeon D 1700 series and also the Xeon D 2700 series. Now, both of these are called Ice Lake-D, but as you would imagine from the number, the Xeon D 2700 series is a replacement for the Xeon D 2100 series, which was Skylake-D. And then the Xeon D 1700 series is a replacement for that kind of like Broadwell-DE, but really like the Xeon D 1500 series. And then there was like a 1600 series that we never got to try, but there was a 1600 series as well. And so this really replaces both of those lines. And you may have heard Ice Lake-D and thought, well, hey, is the Ice Lake-D, is that the same as the 3rd generation Intel Xeon Scalable Ice Lake, not Cooper Lake, but Ice Lake edition? And the answer is that the cores are both Sunny Cove cores. They're 10 nanometer, and they are pretty similar, but there are definitely some differences between the main, Ice Lake Xeon that goes in sockets and stuff, and then the Xeon D series. So we definitely get a couple of major feature upgrades, and let me just kind of give off a couple of those. So first, I mentioned that we have the Sunny Cove cores. We also get things like we get VNNI for AI acceleration. And if you have seen some of our recent pieces, we'll link these in the description. But VNNI for doing things like AI edge inferencing is actually pretty useful because you can do a lot of inferencing at a lot higher speeds without necessarily putting in a accelerator like a GPU or something like that. And so you can basically do that accelerated inferencing on these CPUs because you can do things like innate inferencing. In terms of memory bandwidth, you may see it on the slide and think, wait a sec, that's kind of interesting, isn't it? And the reason it's interesting is you'll see the Xeon-D 2700 series has 4 memory channels. And so far, the Xeon-D 2700 series, when we've seen them in systems, have had 4 memory channels all populated. But the other one I think is more interesting, which is Xeon-D 1700 series. You're going to see that this actually says that it has 3 memory channels. But I'm just going to hold up these 2 platforms, which are Xeon-D 1700 series platforms. And what you're going to see is that these are definitely 2 memory channel configurations. So I think in the Xeon-D 1700 series, a lot of the systems that we're going to see are going to be dual memory channel. I just think 3 is kind of interesting, the fact that they actually have that, but most of the platforms are going to be 2. And that memory on the Xeon-D 2700 series can actually go up to DDR4 3200, and you can get up to DDR4 2933 on the Xeon-D 1700 series. Both are pretty big jumps over the previous generation, just because they're basically replacing parts from more or less the 2017 and also 2015 generations of Xeon cores. Other features that we're going to get are we're also going to get PCIe Gen 4 in this generation, but there's going to be a difference between the 2700 series and also the 1700 series. The 2700 series is going to get 32 lanes of PCIe Gen 4, while the 1700 series is going to get 16 lanes of PCIe Gen 4. And whether you're coming from the D1500, 1600 series, or you're coming from the D2100 series, the big feature there is really that PCIe Gen 4, which gives you more bandwidth, and you can handle just higher speed devices there. I also just want to draw your attention real quick to the fact that there are 24 lanes of high-speed I/O, and that you can use for like USB, you can use it for SATA, or you can use it as PCIe Gen 3 as well. Intel didn't give us a block diagram of that, but when you look at something like the Xeon-D 2100 series, what you notice is that the Xeon-D 2100 series basically had a Lewisburg PCH kind of IP built in, and that 24 is in the range of what a Lewisburg PCH would have. So you basically, I think, would have a IP block similar to what you would see in a high-end Xeon. And when you actually look at the LSPCI output, you're actually going to see something similar. So something that we are seeing on a lot of the platforms is we are seeing higher density connections that can be either used for things like PCIe or SATA, depending on how you configure it in BIOS. And that's kind of one of the advantages to this kind of high-speed I/O configuration or configurability. And that is definitely a hallmark of the entire Xeon-D line. And the whole idea is that you can really go from a platform that's kind of like your main Xeon scalable servers, and you also have the ability to go and run things on the edge using the exact same architecture. And so that's very much the idea and blueprint for the Xeon-D processors. Another area that Intel's done a lot of work with Ice Lake is also improving the crypto acceleration. And so that is something that will also go into the Skylake-D. And so you see a big improvement if you can actually access that. And that's something that we have looked at before. Another Ice Lake feature that is in Skylake-D as well is Intel SGX, which is Intel's Secure Enclave technology. When I actually looked in the BIOS of the Supermicro system, not only did I see SGX, but I also saw total memory encryption. But then when I flipped it to enabled, it still said disabled, but we're also using pre-production firmware on our boxes. So of course, everything that we're going to do in this, I just want to note, is going to be, using pre-production firmware. So things will get updated in the future, but I just kind of saw that there and I thought, ooh, that's interesting. But basically, these are new security features that are in Intel's processors. They did a lot with Ice Lake in terms of coming out with new features and with new types of security features. So these are just a couple of them. Now, at this point, I know we're going to get a lot of people that say, wait, you're in the BIOS. Does VTD work? Is there a VTD switch? Because that was a thing that you had to kind of, especially with the very, very first Xeon-D chips, that was a thing. And the answer is that yes, Xeon-D Skylake-D generation does have VTD. So for you virtualization folks, get excited. Now, some of the SKUs have QuickAssist, and of course we don't have the SKU list, so I don't know exactly which ones, or I can't show you which ones right now, but because there are restrictions in terms of crypto and what you can export and stuff like that, they're not going to be in every single model. But if you do have QAT, there are actually 2 different versions of QAT in the Skylake-D generation. So what you're going to see is that if you have the Xeon-D 2700 series, you have Gen 3 QuickAssist, but if you have the Xeon-D 1700 series, you have Gen 2 QuickAssist. And why that matters is because if you want to do like look-aside processing, or if you want to have things like inline IPsec crypto offloads, I mean, those are the types of things that the Gen 3 is actually a little bit better, or actually significantly better at. And so there is a definite difference in terms of the overall QuickAssist experience if you're on the 2700 series versus the 1700 series. And that delta on the network and QAT side also extends to just the overall network fabric. The new generation of processors can do up to 100 gigabits per second. So on the Xeon D 1700 series, which is like this Supermicro platform right here, we actually have 25 gig Ethernet. And this 25 gig Ethernet comes off of the 100 gig network controller that we actually have on the chip itself. And this uses basically the network IP from the Intel 800 series. So we get things like iWarp, and we also get Rocky V2. So there are RDMA offloads on this, which is super cool. And that is absolutely awesome in the space. Now on the Xeon D 2700 series, you can actually get a flexible packet processor and switch that kind of sits in front of both the SoC and also the QuickAssist technology. And so that's actually kind of cool, especially if you're going to have a higher end networking like a firewall or VPN box. You probably would want that, is my guess. But overall, this is a huge upgrade in terms of embedded networking for the Xeon D space. So let's talk about applications and some of the systems, and then we're going to get to performance and maybe some power consumption as well. So first off, one of the big, I guess, areas that Intel's really pushing Skylake-D into is really that whole vRAN space. And if you're not aware of the space, basically the idea is that a lot of the 5G operators and a lot of operators saying, hey, instead of using proprietary systems, we should use kind of more open, kind of standardized systems, and then be able to go and run different types of workloads all over and make our lives way easier than if we're using these kind of like closed proprietary systems. And so for this, Intel actually has something pretty interesting, which is the radio unit and distributed unit all put together in a single box that they call Fort Columbia. Now you can see it on the slide, but wouldn't it be really cool if I just had one in my, oh, I do. I actually have one in my hand. And let's kind of talk about why this thing is really interesting, because there's actually a lot more going on here in terms of like the overall Intel ecosystem, but it also kind of helps you understand where Intel is kind of positioning this. So a couple of things, it's amazing to just see how this kind of development platform differs from that first Beverly Cove one or whatever the heck that was called. But it is amazing to just see how far the development platforms have come, because this is definitely way more refined and there's a lot more going on here than the first Xeon D platform that we looked at many years ago. Okay, so the key components here are, you're going to see that there's this kind of white shell, and you might be wondering what that is. Well, that's actually this, which is a kind of piece of plastic that RF signals can actually pass through without too much interference. And so that's basically the idea of what's going on with this thing. It's a very compact, remember, has the radio in it as well. And then from there, you have this just giant big baseboard. And there are a couple of things that I want to point out here, because of course there's Skylake-D, which we'll get to in a second, but there are actually a couple other pieces of Intel silicon that are, I think, pretty interesting. And the first one is that there's actually an eASIC FEC logic kind of chip that's here. And that's really kind of an offload chip that's very specific to forward error correction. And then the other thing is that there's an ARIA FPGA. So you also have the FPGA side, you have the eASIC, we have an ASIC side from Intel, and then you also have Xeon D. And in case you're wondering what the cutouts are for at the top, those are actually for the 5G radios. And if you want to see what a 5G radio looks like, just happens that we have one of those too. In terms of networking, of course, we have our 25 gig networking, but the other interesting one is actually that this has 2 PoE ports. Now, of course, these systems use actually a decent amount of power, but you can actually use these if you have PoE++, you can actually power this entire system over PoE with these 2 inputs. And then of course, tying this together, we have our Xeon D. Now this is a COM-HPC kind of card that you actually have Skylake-D on, and you basically put this onto the system, and that's kind of how you tie everything together. What that means though is that you can actually take this out and you could go and have a lower core count SKU, you could have a higher core count SKU, maybe you want a QAT enabled one. I mean, there's all kinds of different types of chips that you may want to go put in there, and this allows you to have, pick that, because these CPUs are soldered on, they're not socketed, so this kind of gives you that kind of configurability. And of course, I reached out to the Supermicro folks since we've been reviewing their stuff since like 2015 in the Xeon D space. But I think a lot of people are going to be super excited about this platform right here. Now, this actually has a Xeon D, and this is a 10 core. There are different cores, so you can get different core counts of this. 10 cores, I guess, is going to be the most expensive and kind of the high end of this, but there are going to be lower cost options. But then the other thing that you have here, you have 2 channels of memory, so you can put DDR4 2933 in this. But let's just get to it, because this is the exciting part, I think, for a lot of folks, is the fact that we actually get 25 gig Ethernet, which is our SFP28 ports that you're going to see there. But then we also get 10 gig Ethernet because we have 2 RJ45 ports that are 10 gig Ethernet as well. Something I thought was just super fun is that because 10 gig Ethernet, of course, you have pretty warm PHYs, you actually can see that we get this like kind of giant heatsink here, which I just think looks fun. And of course, we have our baseboard management controller, PCIe, and all that kind of expandability that you would kind of expect in a system like this. But I think for a firewall, I think a lot of people are going to be very excited about this. Just showing off another system. This is actually the E300 chassis with the FlexATX. And this one is actually only 4 cores, so it definitely is a lot more affordable. We don't actually have pricing on these because we don't have the SKU list. So we don't have pricing on these exactly yet because they're still a little bit away from release. But this will be a more affordable option. But of course, one of the cool things is it's pretty small. You can rack mount it. You can also just put it as a desktop unit. So if you're using it as a desktop firewall, we actually use these in a couple locations for that, or the Xeon-D 2100 series ones we actually use in a couple locations. And one of the cool things, of course, is the fact that we get not only, you see our SFP 28 cages, but you also see that we get 4 1 gig Ethernet ports as well. So again, in a pretty compact form factor, you get definitely a lot of networking, and you also get things like internal M.2 and all kinds of stuff like that. Of course, we are going to have reviews of the motherboards and also the systems on the STH main site over the coming weeks. We're just kind of waiting for a few firmware things until we can do that. But we also have a very interesting Supermicro system, and this is a one-use system. This is the 110D system from Supermicro, and this actually has the Xeon-D 2700 series, and I kind of figured, you know, this has 16 cores. It's the Xeon-D 2775 Te, and I was like, hey, I think this is one that people are going to want to see. So we actually fired it up and ran benchmarks with it. Again, this is definitely pre-production firmware, so I want to get everybody's expectations that when you look at these charts, again, pre-production firmware. But what we basically saw is that when we compared it to the Xeon-D 2183 IT, which was a 16 core of the previous generation that also had, by the way, 10% higher base clock speeds. What we actually saw was that, well, the Ice Lake generation, we actually saw better performance. Now in the future, we're gonna get into more depth, but I just wanted to kind of show a couple different workloads. What you're gonna notice is that we also have the Xeon-D 1587, and that was actually the 16 core Xeon-D, so Broadwell-DE 1500 series part. You're gonna notice from there, there's absolutely a huge delta. And that was really because I think 16 cores in that older Xeon-D with like the dual rings and stuff like that, that was definitely I guess not the most optimal configuration, but it was the best that you could do at that time. But of course, now the industry has moved on and we have, I guess, better mesh solutions than we previously had. And so this is something that I see a lot of performance gains in, and I'm actually really excited just the fact that we are getting performance here. Now, of course, these are really not using any of the new accelerators. So VNNI for AI acceleration, we're not using the crypto offloads, any of those kind of things that we have already gone through and done quite a bit of in terms of just kind of showing folks, what the new performance features are of the Ice Lake generation. So again, we'll link that in the description, but those things do apply, and we did validate at least that VNNI was working on this platform. We're just going to wait until we actually get kind of release firmware. And once we get the full release firmware set on this board, we'll do our kind of more formal benchmark. And so while we see some moderate gains really versus the Xeon-D 2100 series in terms of, 16 core to 16 core, what we are going to see a lot more performance on is when we get to those accelerated workloads, because you see not only better performance, but you also get better power efficiency because you get so much more performance at not really a big power delta. And so that's another piece that we had. We just looked at the power consumption deltas using accelerators. We'll link that in the description as well. Now, in terms of power consumption, we did see that the one-use system, now again, we're only using the Xeon-D 2775 Te system here, and this is Supermicro on pre-release firmware. And what we got was we basically saw idle once we kind of settled down into about 71 watts. And then we would see a maximum, like when we're doing AVX 512 and all those kind of workloads that we're not going to show, but we actually ran, we actually did get about 191 watts on this platform. I do want to note though, that just in terms of overall, this is going to be a much higher power consumption platform just because of the fan and cooling setup. As we saw recently, fans can actually use something like 15-20% of the total system power. So this is not really the same optimized setup that we would normally do for our power consumption numbers when we do kind of like our SKU comparisons. This is kind of more of designed to be a pretty specific network solution, a network 1U box from Supermicro. So I just want to go point that out before people like draw too many conclusions and stuff. This is really pre-release firmware. It's also not a very optimized platform. So of course, we'll get to that at a later date. Overall though, I mean, how excited can you be? It's been years since we've gotten a new chip in this space, and we finally have Ice Lake-D. I've been waiting for this for a long time. We've been working on trying to do this piece for months, and I'm so excited the fact that I get to actually show you this. Now, of course, you've probably seen that we have a lot of platforms, which means that we're gonna have a lot of content on the STH main site in terms of new Intel Xeon-D platforms that we're going to do reviews of, and we're definitely going to have that over the coming weeks and months. But if there is something that you specifically want to see, well, use that comment section and let me know what you want to see. I am super excited about the space. I always really just love this series, and then also the Atom, C2000, C3000 series. So I'm pretty excited the fact that we have a new chip in the space. And the fact that we have 25 gig Ethernet, I think is absolutely awesome. And I'm also kind of excited that we have things that are not just a bunch of cores, like new cores or something like that. We actually have things like the new QuickAssist. We have 25 gig and actually up to 100 gig Ethernet on this platform. We have things like the new switch. And then we also have all the accelerators for things like crypto acceleration, but also things like AI. I know that video analytics, like we're getting a lot of people asking about video analytics and can you do inferencing? Here's a really good solution for that. So hey, I hope you enjoyed this look at the brand new Skylake-D generation. And if you did, well, why don't you give this video a like, click subscribe, turn on those notifications so you can see whenever we come out with great new videos. As always, thanks for watching. Have an awesome day.